Hi, my name is Mike Rodelli. I've been a student of the case of the Zodiac Killer for 25 years, since 1998, and I'm also the author of the book In the Shadow of Mount Diablo, The Shocking True Identity of the Zodiac Killer. My book is currently receiving 4.4 stars on Amazon. I don't know if you can see it. I'll hold it up there. And it has many 5-star reviews. I've decided to update my YouTube channel, which I haven't done in like 3 years, because I want to talk about DNA in the Zodiac case, which I feel is the most important issue surrounding the Zodiac case right now. This is the last day of 2023, and also going into 2024, I feel it's going to be the biggest issue surrounding the case. I had a choice of either tackling this issue from the standpoint of starting with the 2002 ABC show, which I was on, and working backwards to 1998, or doing it chronologically. And I've decided to do it chronologically. So I'm going to start my discussion in about 1998 with the work of Alan Keel. Alan Keel was the director of SFPD's forensics lab in the late 1990s, and it was he who did the initial research on the Zodiac letters to try to recover DNA from them. The first thing Keel did, and it's logical from a scientific standpoint — I am a scientist, by the way. I have a master's degree in biological oceanography from the University of Rhode Island, which is a prestigious oceanography school here in the U.S. From a scientific standpoint, Keel did the right thing. He started off by determining that Zodiac had in fact licked his stamps and envelopes. Now, many people nowadays feel that because Zodiac sent his letters in the late 60s and early 70s up to like 1974 or so, there could be some later ones depending on who you believe. But I believe he stopped in 1974 with the Count Marco letter. The Count Marco letter would have come 12 years before the advent of DNA technology in 1986. And of course, the earlier letters would have come even earlier than 12 years before the advent of DNA technology. So people say to themselves, and they form a conclusion, not a hypothesis, not a thing that can be changed, but they form a solid set conclusion that because Zodiac sent his letters prior to the advent of DNA, there's no reason in the world why he would not have licked them. Therefore, he must have licked them, and there must be DNA on them, and DNA must solve the Zodiac case, as law enforcement has told us many times over the years. I'll get into what I think law enforcement is up to a little bit later on. But what Keel did is he didn't make any assumptions like that. He didn't assume that Zodiac had licked his stamps and envelopes. Well, actually, in the technique that he used to try to recover the materials that he was recovering, he actually did make an assumption, I think, that Zodiac had licked his stamps and envelopes, and I'll get into that as we go along. But he didn't. It was more like a hypothesis to him, not a firm conclusion that Zodiac had licked his stamps and envelopes. So Alan Keel started off by testing the letters, the true Zodiac letters, for the presence of saliva. And the way you test for the presence of saliva is by looking for the presence of a salivary enzyme named amylase. Amylase is a salivary enzyme. It's an enzyme that's in your saliva that breaks down the starches that you eat. So if you eat like a potato or something, it begins breaking down those complex carbohydrates into simpler carbohydrates. And that's the marker for saliva. You can't just test for saliva because saliva is just a generic term. You have to test for something that's in saliva. And what he tested for was amylase. And this is a standard test for the presence of saliva on letters even today. So what he did, the technique he chose to use, was to cut out small squares of the stamps and small squares of the envelopes, the flaps. And he took these entire pieces, which would have included the outside of the stamp, the underside of the stamp, and the envelope it was attached to. And he put that into an extracting solution, and probably as it got wet and more mushy, he would probably break it down with, I don't know, like a mortar and pestle, or somehow he would break up the envelope, so that the piece of envelope and the stamp, so that DNA from the underside of the stamp, the outside of the stamp, and anything that was on the envelope would have been extracted in that solution. And what he found by looking at all the Zodiac letters is that he expected a certain amount. When someone licks something, they put a certain amount of saliva and cells on the letter. Well, what Kjell found is that he found many fewer cells and much less salivary amylase activity than he expected. So his conclusion was that it would not have been unfair to say that Zodiac had applied the stamps and had sealed the envelope flaps using a sponge and water, just plain tap water. Now, Kjell is a political animal, as we've found out recently by trying to contact him and get him to comment on the things that he said to me in 2007, that he said to Lyndon Lafferty, another Zodiac researcher, I believe even before he spoke to me. And what he told the two of us was essentially the same, that the true Zodiac letters, the ones that are from the Zodiac killer, have so little amylase activity. He called it background amylase activity. In other words, just bare amounts, not anywhere near the amount of that you would see in the letter that had been licked. And background amounts of cells, again, you would expect to see a lot of cells on a letter that someone had actually licked. That there was so little on these envelopes that these stamps that he concluded that Zodiac probably had used a sponge. He would not commit to saying that Zodiac did not lick the stamps and envelopes because he's a political person. I think he didn't want to step on the toes of current day investigators, current day even back in 1998 and 2007 when he spoke to me. So instead of making an emphatic statement that Zodiac did not lick the stamps and envelopes, he said that it would not be unfair to say that he used a sponge. And that was the best we were able to get out of Kjell at the time. Now, the technique that Kjell used was the standard technique that is used to assay letters that are assumed to have been licked by the sender. In other words, most people lick their stamps and envelopes, at least in those days. Nowadays, you would use a pre-glued stamp, so you wouldn't lick the stamp, but you would probably lick the envelope. I'm sure people out there watching have licked a lot of envelopes to send bills and things like that, Christmas cards, whatever. So he used a standard technique that had the underlying assumption within it that Zodiac had licked the stamps and envelopes. What I think Kjell should have done, and I think he made a gaffe here, is that when he analyzed 5 or 6 or 10 letters and found out that there were only background amounts of saliva and cells on them, he probably should have resorted to a different technique, which would have been to peel back the stamp and swab just the glue side of the stamp to see if the background amounts of amylase and cells he was finding were actually from the front of the stamp, or if there's anything actually at all on the back of the stamp. It may have been that there was nothing on the back of the stamp at all because Zodiac used a sponge and tap water to put them on. So I think that Kjell made a mistake there. I wish that he would have switched gears in the middle of his investigation, but he didn't apparently. Apparently, from what I know, he only used the technique of cutting out the pieces of the stamp and immersing that into the extracting solution and getting DNA, or not DNA, but cells and possibly amylase that could have been a contaminant. Now, the interesting thing about the notion of contamination is that you would expect there to be just background amounts of saliva and cells on these letters if they were contaminated by someone sneezing on them or coughing on them or licking their finger and then turning the page or spraying while they spoke, things like that. You wouldn't expect there to be as much saliva and cells on the letters as it would be if someone actually licked them, where they put tremendous amounts of saliva and cells on the stamp and on the letters. So the notion that there were only background amounts is actually consistent with the notion that the letters weren't licked, and that the amounts of the very small background amounts of saliva and cells that they were finding on the letters was actually from someone, accidentally spitting on them or licking their finger, things like that. So the results seem to be consistent. In other words, there's only background amounts, and the background amounts would logically come from incidental contact with the stamp, not actually licking it. So Kjell's results are actually very important because they tell us that Zodiac didn't lick his stamps and envelopes, basically. Now, in contrast to the Zodiac letters, there were two letters that Keel deemed forgeries. And these two letters had, in contrast to the Zodiac letters, had abundant cells on them, abundant salivary action in the testing that he did, and also abundant DNA. So he was able to actually, using the primitive techniques, this is prior to PCR being introduced to SFPD's lab in the late 90s. I think PCR wasn't introduced until about 2002 when Dr. Holt was there. So he was able to use primitive techniques of the late 90s to isolate DNA from both of these forgeries. And one of them he told me, and he also told Lyndon Lafferty, was the 1978 letter. The second one, he said he didn't recall which letter it was, but it was one of the 1974 letters. Now, to be polite, I think that Keel was not being totally honest when he said that he couldn't remember which letter it was. I mean, if you were analyzing the Zodiac letters, and one of the 1974 letters, the canonical four 1974 letters, Exorcist, SLA, Badlands, and Count Marco, if one of those four was actually a forgery, that's something that would be seared into your mind. You wouldn't forget that. I seriously doubt that he forgot it. I think that what he was doing is he was playing politics. It was a holdback. It was something that they didn't want the public to know. And so he said he forgot which one it was. But I'm sure that he knows which letter it was, because that's something that if I were doing the analysis, I would certainly not forget, because these are letters that are widely believed to have come from the Zodiac. And if one of them didn't, then that would be big news, and it wouldn't be something I would forget. Now, he left it to us amateurs to try to figure out which one of the 1974 letters was a forgery. And in about 2000 or 2001, Tom Voigt was able to get his hands on a chart of Keel's, what I presume was Keel's work, which showed the letters and, would say some cells found, whatever. We don't know where these cells came from. They could have come from the front of a stamp, from the contaminated side. But it lists all the letters that were analyzed, and the only 1974 letter that had been analyzed by the time Keel left, according to that chart, is the Exorcist letter. And that's a 74 letter. So my presumption is, and this is just a presumption based on the evidence that I have access to, is that the 1974 Exorcist letter was the one that had the DNA on it that matched the 1978 letter. Now, the interesting thing about both of those letters is that they both came at a time when there had been a long gap between communications from the Zodiac, and you could conceive of someone possibly trying to keep the case alive by having those letters show up at the times they did. The other thing is that the Exorcist letter also came, I think, the day after or the day of one of the big events in the Zebra case. So the Zebra case was going to start stealing headlines, or was already stealing headlines from the Zodiac case. This would have made it even more so that it was stealing headlines from the Zodiac case. So a person may have had a motive to want to bring Zodiac back into the picture by sending a letter that was allegedly from the Zodiac killer. The Exorcist letter had a palm print on it. None of the other Zodiac letters had a palm print on it. People say that I'm trying to bury the palm print because it doesn't match my suspect, and that's the reason I'm saying that the Exorcist letter may be a forgery. That's not the case. I don't know that my suspect was ever compared to the handprint. They would have had to have gone to him and gotten his handprints probably, and I doubt that they did that because they barely wanted to speak to him, let alone get significant evidence from him. So I'm not saying that the Exorcist letter was a forgery in order to bury the palm print. That's just some sour grapes by some people, I think. The reason I'm saying it is that it's the only letter that had been tested for the presence of saliva and cells at the time that Alan Keel was in the lab. There's no mention of the SLA letter, the Badlands letter, or the Count Marco letter in the report. Now, because of recent developments that have just taken place in 2023, I used to think that maybe Count Marco was the other forgery, possibly, if it wasn't the Exorcist. But I've learned a lot about Count Marco and his relationship, especially to my suspect. My suspect would have known Count Marco pretty well, and I think that because of that, I lean towards the fact that there was a reason for my suspect writing the Count Marco letter. So personally, I don't think the Count Marco letter is the forgery. So that would leave SLA and Badlands as being the possible forgeries, if it's not the Exorcist letter. But I believe it was the Exorcist letter because that's the only one that had been tested by the time that Keel left. I think that's about it for now. I'll be back with more, and I'll take you through the chronology of DNA in the Zodiac case. The next stop on our tour is going to be the 2002 ABC show. Now that you know the backdrop of what Sidney Holt, who was the lab director then, would have known about the Zodiac letters being essentially devoid of saliva and cells, I think that puts a different light on the DNA that was allegedly found in 2002 that was said to have come from the Zodiac killer.